Hello and good evening all. Tonight our examinations bring us to the UK to look at two TVRs from very different decades, lumped together for one video because I wanted to make an alliterative joke for the title, and because the two cars represent more or less the bookends of the company's fortunes, with the 1967 Tuscan, the company's first in-house built high-performance model, and the 2000 Tuscan, one of the models that went out with the company's 2006 disintegration, at which point the T400R was also retired from racing. I'll slip in some commentary about the Grantura, Vixen, and Cerbera as well, so really this video is about a quintet of TVRs rather than a Tale of Two Tuscans, which could also be about Sandro Botticelli and Leonardo da Vinci. But first, a brief history of the marque. TVR's early history and growth can charitably be described as organic and cynically as disordered. Originally founded as Trev Car Motors by Trevor Wilkinson at the age of 23, shortly after the end of the second WW, the firm offered a variety of engineering services as well as garage work for extant vehicles, building their first self-designed cars in 1949 and the early 1950s before progressing into selling kits of their first marketed vehicle, the TVR Sports Saloon. Although each of these kits was essentially a custom job based on client requests, so calling it a true model might be coming it a bit high, particularly as it mostly used parts from the Austin A40. But a wide number of engines were used, not just from the A40, and the bodies were sourced from a third party to boot. It's all very kiddie these days. The company, which had adopted the TVR moniker as a contraction of the original name about a year after opening, finally started to get serious about building a proper car in the back half of the 1950s, bolstered by requests from a Raymond Seidel of New Hampshire, who wanted to import, sell, and race TVR's cars on this side of the Atlantic. Originally sending just chassis to the US, it was Seidel's responsibility to body and market the cars, which he did under his own auspices as Jomars, another contraction, this time of his children's names. 56 saw the first TVR-penned bodywork, which went on the same chassis as the Jomar and became the Open Sports, followed by a notchback coupe to address usability concerns, because, as I'm reliably informed, it does rain sometimes in England land, and this was sold as the TVR Coupe, or Coupe. Fortunately, both the marque's name choices and aesthetics would become more interesting with practice. A glowing review in Autosport described the Open Sports as superb, but much of the sales activity in the early days took place in the US, as Seidel was running at least half a dozen of the TVRs that he had imported as race cars to drum up further business. Attempts to improve the styling brought this car, which was offered with 5 engine options, 2 Ford options, 2 Coventry options, or the BMC B-Series engine employed at that time in the MGA. Though several names were allegedly considered, including Trevor and Who Hill Hellcat, mercifully they settled on Grantura. Though the Grantura was also positively reviewed, TVR was struggling to produce or sell cars, and with their debts mounting, the company was dissolved for the first time, then restructured as 2 separate legal entities to avoid UK purchase tax on kit cars. I believe this was in 1962. Then the relationship with Seidel broke down, and the garage-built nature of the firm really began to catch up with it, as nobody seemed to really know how much of anything they had, or what they were doing, how the cars were to be priced, or even in some instances how they were to be manufactured. It was only through the fortunate hiring of an ex-Rolls-Royce employee named John Tharner that things started to turn around before the close of the decade, as he implemented improved production methods and general improvements to the firm's organization. With 1960, okay, it was wrong, it was 1959 for the first dissolution, with 1960 seeing Grantura production up, increasing interest from distributors, and in 1962, a trio of Grantura Mark IIAs went racing, bearing the factory nameplate for the first time with an entry at the 12 Hours of Sebring. Hooray! Incidentally, post-production Lensler here, this section was supposed to feature photos from the 3 TVRs that ran at Le Mans Classic last year, but I somehow missed all of the Grid 3 races through a combination of a desire for a nap, followed by my camera battery dying, then the arrival of nighttime and the need to leave to get a flight back to the US early the next morning. Next year, perhaps. The racing Granturas were largely Mark IIs and IIIs, but the underlying chassis architecture was consistent across all three generations, and consisted of a steel tube frame core with subframes for the front and rear suspension. The suspension subframes were derived from the Volkswagen Beetle, and the brakes were pulled out of the Austin Healey parts bin, nothing particularly unusual for small volume manufacturers in those days, although the rear brakes, in the case of the TVR, were mounted inboard. Healey himself actually started this way before the 100, as a matter of fact. The body, however, was all TVR, and established a number of unique design features that carried through the Mark's production for years. The body was fiberglass, or glass-reinforced plastic, to use the engineering euphemism. The hood opened forward, not dissimilar to a number of cars from the more northern reaches of Europe, and the car rather inconveniently lacked any sort of trunk or boot access, depending on one's regionalization word choices. This latter feature is not something that was precisely carried over to later TVRs, but the sort of impractical design choices were. Thus, in the case of the Grantura, all access to the rear storage area, including access to the spare wheel, was through the main doors. This, of course, is yet another fine example of convenience in modern automotive design. One needn't even exit the car to access the spare wheel. Anyway, the engine options were, as mentioned a moment ago, with the 1960s standard 1.6-liter MGA powerplant providing generally comparable performance to what one received from Abingdon's best efforts, although in my opinion the A is the far more attractive vehicle to take to top speeds of around 100 miles an hour and 0 to 60 in about 12-ish seconds. In 1963, the Mark III came in with updates to the chassis to lengthen the car and improve stiffness without fundamentally changing the geometry, as well as improving the independent suspension with coil springs and wishbones. TVR also replaced the 1.6-liter engine with the larger 1.8-liter unit that came in with the MGB, although early cars used up the remaining stock of 1.6-liter powerplants first, reportedly the first dozen or so cars. Though the attempt at the fearsome Sebring 12-hour race was overambitious for the firm, with 2 of the 3 cars retiring early, things also actually went a little better at Le Mans that year. There were other motorsports entries, however, through the year that brought at least a few successes at a regional level to lend some credence to the model's sporting pretensions. Nevertheless, by the end of the year, TVR's ambition had outstripped its pocketbook. Their distributors had gone bankrupt or left, and they were again out of money, this time sending TVR into receivership. Well, its manufacturing half anyway. The tax dodge split had some other benefits because the composites and bodywork side of the business were still operating, and they were able to complete around 100 Mark III models during the 1963-64 receivership bankruptcy thing. These cars, though technically built by an unemployed workforce, were nonetheless considered the best of the models for motorsports applications due to changes in the homologation rules that allowed them to run wider tires and a limited slip differential, as well as benefit from the larger MGB powerplant, which produced a nominal 90 horsepower, but could, of course, be tuned up to greater outputs. And the model's most enduring popularity has been in historic racing, as seen here. These production efforts, combined with re-established distribution relationships, brought the firm back into solvency, and a collaboration with another group of Americans, this time led by Dick Monick and Jack Griffith, who, following a dinner with a certain Mr. Carroll Shelby, and intent on creating a car that could beat his Cobras, dropped a Ford V8 motor into a Grantura instead of an AC Ace, and called it the Griffith. The original Griffith Series 200 was admittedly a bit of a bodge job, but immensely powerful for its lightweight frame, with the chassis cut away or bashed out of the way to fit the 4.74-liter small block Ford. Available with either 195 horsepower or 271 horsepower engine of the same displacement, performance was reported at somewhere in the mid-4-second range for 0 to 60, a quarter mile in 13.8 seconds, and top speed well in excess of 150 miles an hour. Although this did require perfect conditions to achieve, they are still metrics that would be more than welcome in most performance models of today. Subsequent iterations on the design did improve livability, but the cars, in a common refrain for TVRs ever since, apparently struggled with reliability, and when a dock strike made importation of the chassis virtually impossible, ties with TVR were severed, and with their main source of profit gone, TVR was out of business yet again before the end of 1964. Then, a father and son team, Arthur and Martin Lilly, decided to try their hand at running the marque, having lost a few £1,000s as shareholders in the previous iteration of the organization. They brought back some of the old staff, invested additional money in the firm, found a new U.S. importer who promised to work on ameliorating the reputational damage done by Griffith's apparently shoddy workmanship, and started developing new models to reinvigorate sales, debuting the Vixen and Tuscan in 1967. While the Tuscan was originally powered by a V8 in the same vein as the Griffith, it was not a sales success, and the Vixen is the car that helped turn TVR's fortunes around. Essentially an iterative development of the Grantura 1800S, which, you guessed it from the name, used the uprated MGB 1.8-liter engine, the Vixen continued to use the same steel backbone tube chassis and brakes as the Grantura, while improving the suspension to double wishbones on all four wheels, but ditched the BMC engine for an 88-horsepower Ford Kent power plant due to difficulties in securing a consistent supply of the BMC engine, as well as a desire to lower the car's price. This was also the reason for the continued use of fiberglass for bodywork, as an early attempt by the Lillys to move to a metal-bodied car was determined to be cost-prohibitive. The Vixen was, as with all TVRs of its era, improved over its 7-year production life, with the second-generation S2 model using the so-called long wheelbase chassis of the larger-engine Tuscan, after customers complained that the Series 1 was too difficult to get in and out of, I say so-called long because even the long wheelbase chassis was still only 90 inches, which is minuscule. It's less than 8 feet. Aiming for a sportier version to sit in between the V8-powered Tuscan, which we'll touch on in a moment, and the base model, there were 2 additional Vixen models offered with tuned-up engines from Speedwell, the Sports and Super Sports, which featured improved engine balancing, ported heads, and twin Weber carbs that upped the Kent's power to 100 or 115 horsepower respectively. The Series 3 received a slight power bump for the base model to 92 horsepower, and the last Series 4 and 2500 models were actually an entirely new car underneath, using the new M-Series chassis, but the older bodywork, as the molds for the new cars weren't ready in 1972. With the 2500 blurring the line between the Vixen and Tuscan with a Triumph-sourced 2.5-liter straight 6 that nevertheless only produced 105 horsepower because of American emission standards. Of all the Vixens, the S2 was by far the most produced at 438 cars, and also saw the greatest use in competition. Again, largely regional entries at this stage in the game, followed by the 2500 at 385 units. Working now backwards in time, the later and less interesting version of the Tuscan, the one replaced by the Vixen 2500, was the Tuscan V6, which came in 2 years after the V8 and sported a 3-liter Ford Essex power plant, which is nowhere near as impressive as the aircraft carrier of the same name, that nevertheless gave a 2-fingered salute to the U.S. market's emission standards and made 138 horsepower and 182 pound-feet of torque, which is respectable for something weighing only around 750 kilos. One was allegedly imported to the U.S. as a Vixen, but this may be apocryphal. While the V6 was certainly an improvement over its successor, the Tuscan V8 is the beastie of real interest in this section of our story, and the Tuscan V8 debuted essentially concurrently with the Vixen Series 1 in 1967. Taking inspiration from the Griffith, but with a combined emphasis on better quality control and drivability, the V8 used a, you guessed it, Ford Windsor V8, 4.7 liters, outputting 271 horsepower and making the car good for 155 miles an hour, which still seems terrifying in something that small. However, unlike the Griffith that preceded it and the V6 that succeeded it, the Tuscan V8 received uprated disc brakes on all 4 wheels. The V6 and Griffith had rear drums, which also helped ameliorate one of the Griffith's key failing points, with the aforementioned long wheelbase chassis quickly developed to further distinguish it from the Griffith in the United States, where it had most of its sales. The V6 came in 1969, cannibalizing sales from the V8, and thus to try and improve the value proposition for the range topper, we got the wide-body SE, restyled with some elements of the impending M-Series and sporting a larger, but by all reports less powerful, emissions again, 4.9-liter V8. The V8 models were the most popular in racing in era, and while the factory largely stayed away from racing for the sake of their finances, the cars proved particularly popular in hill climb events that weren't being dominated by contemporaneous Porsche prototypes, and in SCCA events over in the United States, where its lightweight and driving dynamics made it quite capable against the pony and muscle cars that comprised its main competition. With only 175 or so cars ever made, most of them V6s, the Tuscans are also some of the rarest and most valuable production TVRs of that era, and hence why I've been using pictures of the far more common Vixen. Again, they look really quite similar, so you still have a good idea of what they looked like, and hopefully could recognize one on the streets now. Not that there are that many. An amusing footnote, actually, before we fast forward into the future to look at the more recent Tuscan. TVR also generated rather a lot of controversy, and even a mild kerfuffle, for their participation at the British Motor Show in 1970 and 1971. Not because of any particularly crazy models that they debuted, as TVR's coke-fueled styling era wouldn't come in until the late 90s, but rather because of the models that they hired to show the cars. In what is perhaps best described as a novel marketing tactic, certainly for the era, TVR paid model Helen Jones to showcase herself as much as the 1970 TVRs, and this caused enough raised eyebrows, appreciatively or otherwise, that the next year they quite literally doubled down and brought back Miss Jones and former Page 3 girl Susan Shaw, which sufficiently peeved the trade association responsible for the fair that they threatened TVR with a ban if such tactics were continued in future. So in 1971, they debuted a prototype estate car to balance things out. Post-production Lensler dropping in here again to state that I'm finding it ironic that I managed more than a year and a half and 100 plus videos without ever bringing in something in the sex sells vein, and then throw in a bit about the Continental Grid girls last week, and this week it's bikini models. Well, nude models. Figures. Normal, dull coverage without scantily clad or unclad women will resume next week, presumably. Unless the BMW Z4 GT3 was sold with a year's subscription to the leading gentleman's literature of the time or something. Okay, fast-forwarding through the rest of the 70s, 80s, and 90s to gloss over a factory fire, disagreements with the U.S. government over emissions, almost another bankruptcy, the Wedge era, and the early Wheeler era, all of which certainly merit a future look, but are a story for another time, we come to the modern Tuscan, TVR's last race car. This third and final reboot of the Tuscan nameplate came at the end of a period of relative stability for our Blackpoolers. Actually, is it Blackpoolers or Blackpudlians? Good God, it is actually a demonym. Okay, came to... yes, a Blackpudlian. What a wonderful thing to be called. I live in a black puddle. I've never been to Blackpool. Maybe it's quite nice. This third and final reboot of the Tuscan nameplate came at the end of a period of relative stability for our Blackpudlians that started with the purchase of the company by Peter Wheeler back in 1981 from the Lilies. He took the company in a bolder styling direction than they had done previously, and in the 90s they came out with their first in-house built power plants, designed by Al Melling, starting with the Speed 8 V8 and following it with the aluminum, or more appropriately aluminium, alloy Speed 6, which was actually a straight 6 rather than a V6 one might expect based on the shared architecture of the two power plants. This Speed 6 was produced as either a 3.6 or 4-liter engine, and as usual for TVRs, had some modifications from the prototype that caused oil starvation in the top end of the block and thus premature engine failures. They're not known for their reliability. Never have been, probably never will be. The Tuscan, both road-going and racing versions, went to market with the 4-liter version of this engine, initially producing 360 horsepower and 310 pound-feet of torque, but later versions made up to 400 horsepower and 315 pound-feet of torque respectively. Weight for the road car was 2,425 pounds, or 1,100 kilos, which for a relatively modern car is really quite good, and with a 5-speed manual, performance was as one might expect. But we are more concerned about the race car, which means we're going back to the 90s again. TVR's participation in motorsports through the 90s had been primarily focused on the Tuscan Challenge, in which prospective drivers dueled with a Lorenzo de' Medici impersonator after drinking 2 full bottles of Tignanello before they're permitted to compete in a TVR race car. Yeah, maybe not. TVR Tuscan Challenge was actually a one-make series that came about in 1989 as a means of both strengthening the TVR brand and to prime the market for a sales campaign with the road version of the Tuscan Gen 2, although the latter never came to pass. Using the same construction formula as the original Tuscan, the 90s Tuscan used a V8, originally sourced from Rover, later replaced with the in-house built Speed 8, and throughout the 90s it became one of the biggest one-make series in the United Kingdom, serving both as a feeder and destination series that saw guest drivers including Colin McRae, Anthony Reid, and Tiff Needell, as well as several high-ranking TVR personnel, such as owner Peter Wheeler, all participate. The success of the series, and indeed it continued to run concurrently with the T400Rs campaigns in the wider world in the 2000s, gave TVR the experience and confidence that it needed to make that next step up, and develop a racing car to take on the likes of Porsche, the Dodge Viper, and the Marcos LM600. But they overshot the ambition mark and instead designed the absolutely insane Cerbera Speed 12, intended to beat the McLaren F1 on top speed on the road and go toe-to-toe with the best GT1s on track. Unveiled at the '96 Birmingham Motor Show as a design prototype, this time TVR needed no page 3 girls to attract attention, with the Speed 12's unhinged styling and earth-shattering statistics doing that more effectively than some hips and lips ever could. Sporting a 7.7-liter V12 made by splodging 2 specially constructed steel block Speed 6s together like some sort of petrol-centered jammy dodger, TVR originally advertised a power output of more than 800 horsepower, with various later figures tossed around anywhere between 845 and 1,000. Apparently nobody ever completed a successful test of the full engine, with Wheeler reporting that it had broken a 1,000 horsepower rated dyno, and each bank, when tested individually, showing outputs of about 480 horsepower, so that would land us close to that 1,000 horsepower mark. This beastie sent power to the rear wheels through a custom 6-speed manual transmission, and the racing version beat the road car to market, ready for the 1998 season, just in time for the GT1 rules to die an ignominious death. More details in the DEF CON GT video. Several starts were taken in the '98 British GT Championship before the rule change, but as it was a TVR and an experimental one to boot, starts did not bring about a commensurate number of finishes. The loss of a championship in which to compete thus shifted the focus to the road car and the racing department to the development of a new GT2, the latter of which we will end our video. The Cerbera road car also failed to make it out of the prototype stage, and while orders and deposits had been taken for the £245,000 car, Mr. Wheeler, after driving it, considered it to be too powerful to be usable on the road. Something that nevertheless hadn't stopped Mercedes or Porsche from selling a couple dozen of their Straßenversionen, but that's a different matter. Thus, production plans were scrapped, deposits were returned, and the 3 road-going prototypes were used for spares for frequent breakdowns at any infrequent race outings for the race cars, while one was eventually sold in 2003 to a person individually qualified by Mr. Wheeler. This same car actually just sold again last May at auction for £601,500. And finally, we get to the GT2 effort that came after the Speed 12. The inherent minimalism in TVR's more sensible designs meant that conversion of a road car to race spec was relatively straightforward, and the recently introduced Tuscan was chosen as the platform for the new car. The original intent was for the new design to replace the cars in Tuscan Challenge, but this was pivoted to a full-fat GT, later called GT2, racer after the Cerbera project fell apart, with the new car introduced as the Tuscan R in 2000. Carrying on the main elements of TVR's design since the heady days of yore, while still keeping an eye towards the future, we had a steel tube frame chassis, now wearing carbon fiber bodywork instead of fiberglass. The 4-liter straight-six engine was still there, making 400 horsepower, but the 5-speed manual was replaced with a 6-speed sequential box more suited to racing duties. Suspension was double wishbones with coilovers and dampers. Not sure who provided the wheels, or the gearbox for that matter, but I'm pretty sure AP provided the brakes, which were ventilated discs all around, and total weight for the car was the same as the road car at 1,100 kilos, or 2,425 pounds, which when you consider all the weight that goes in with the roll cage and the extra componentry when you don't have a bunch of luxuries to remove, that's, again, pretty good. Debuting in 2001 as the Tuscan R, the car picked up where the Cerbera had left off, kind of, in the British GT Championship, where the unique sound of its straight six endeared it to fans, and its driving dynamics endeared it to its drivers. Richard Stanton and Steve Hyde, who managed a class win at Castle Combe and 4 other podiums that season, while Martin Short, not the comedian, and Rob Barf took 2 more wins and another podium for the car that had replaced their beloved Cerbera. This latter team, Roll Center, would be the best of the 3 strong TVR entries in the 2002 season, with 4 wins and 4 podiums, placing them within arm's reach of the championship, only to see it fall from their grasp due to reliability issues in the season closer. 2003 brought a renaming of the car, now the T400R, and 2 new DeWalt and Royal Navy-sponsored cars targeting a full Le Mans campaign, which meant their first stop could only be one place: Sebring. While only one of the 2 cars made it to Florida, it faced off against 24 other GT-class competitors, including no less than 17 Porsche 911s from some seriously experienced teams like the Racers Group and Alex Job Racing. And while I'd love to say that the TVR outclassed and outraced all of them to take an inaugural win on the bumps, that would be a bit too much to ask for. Nevertheless, drivers Barf and the 2 Dicks, there's a phrase I never expected to be saying when I started this script, Richard Hay and Richard Stanton comported themselves as professionals to take 7th in class behind 6 911s and a Ferrari. Not at all bad for their first experience battling the bumps, the Florida heat, and apparently in-car temperatures that were more appropriate to the boiler room of Titanic, as they neglected to take the windows out to get some ventilation in the car. Le Mans, on the other hand, didn't go as well for the 2 DeWalt entries. Both qualified in the bottom quartile for GTs. The 91 car was also the first casualty, hit by an LMP2 in Porsche curves and unable to return to the pits, while the other car was out in the early nighttime hours with a broken gearbox. Closer to home, however, the TVRs were really starting to come into their own, taking a podium sweep at Silverstone and, between the DeWalt and Eclipse Racing teams, 2 more wins and 8 more podiums to close out that season, with Eclipse this time missing out on a championship at the last minute due to an accident with a Marcos. 2004 was less successful for the at-home squaddies, and the international chaps showed up with a new, very purple livery and bodywork that looked like the T400s had spent the entire off-season eating pies nonstop. At the same time, I actually think it looks rather good. Nevertheless, the 2 cars managed to finish both Sebring and Le Mans mid-pack, so an improvement over the prior year, and the cars went into their final season, 2005, with high hopes, particularly after the 2 DeWalt cars were purchased by Lawrence Tomlinson to run as part of a 4-strong T400R squad, with their sights set on Sebring, Le Mans, a full-season ELMS run, and the British GT Championship, and the Tourist Trophy besides, all in a single season. But alas, like the wings of Icarus, their ambition melted away under the punishing sunshine of reality, and they were out of the British GT Championship mid-season following a stiff penalty for exceeding noise limits at Castle Combe. Neither Sebring entry finished. The Le Mans entries were not accepted, which left just a sole Peninsula-sponsored car to uphold the marque's honor at Les Sarthe. Incidentally, that car did manage to complete 24 hours of racing, but an insufficient number of laps to be qualified, and the Tomlinson squad's disappointment, though immense, was at least slightly ameliorated by a Class 1-2 at the ELMS season opener at Spa and a podium at the Silverstone Tourist Trophy. This was also, as is so often the case with these things, the car's last season of competition. 2 continuation attempts were made for the model, one in the form of the T440R, as the racing replacement, of which one prototype was produced before new owner Nikolai Smolensky started to disassemble and shutter the firm. The other was the Typhon, named for the deadliest of the Greek mythological monsters, and intended as both a homologation version of the T400R for the road, and as a saner continuation of the work started with the Cerbera. This program, too, was killed off due to engineering difficulties, and as the 2000s went by, the firm's financial difficulties and new ownership, with only 3 completed. Obviously, these are but selected vignettes into the history of one of the motoring world's most consistently interesting, if inconsistently extant, marques. Depending on how this video does, perhaps we'll take a look at the M-Series and Wedge era in a later video. Photos for this one were sourced from a wide range of sites, including my own photos from Sebring and Le Mans Classic, Pinterest, Reddit, the TVR forums, and of course, Assetto Corsa. For this week's call to action, not featuring the 3 sacred words of YouTube,
like, comment, subscribe.
Remember to check your email's spam inbox every once in a while. I've been trying to find lenders to purchase a couple of properties to rehab lately, and even companies I've reached out to and initiated with have sometimes been having their responses end up in spam automatically. It's also quite applicable if you've been job hunting, which is an activity I'm happily done with for a while, but either way, food for thought. As a reminder, photos for sale by donation at the Buy Me a Coffee link in the comments. Details for how to choose which photo you'd want, etc., are in Wednesday's DPI video or the Decon Monza one, or I'm happy to explain further in the comments, but this is already another remarkably long video. Anyway, that just leaves it for me to say, as always, thank you for your time this evening, or whenever and wherever you are watching, and to wish you all good night and a good tomorrow.